Little girl squeezed by giant python in the jungle. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The dense jungle was alive with the symphony of chirping birds and the rustling of unseen creatures beneath the thick foliage. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting golden beams onto the damp earth where tiny creatures scurried in the underbrush. In the midst of this vast wilderness, a small group of explorers trekked cautiously along a narrow path, their boots sinking slightly into the soft, leaf-covered ground. Among them was Sophie, a curious and adventurous 8-year-old girl, her wide eyes filled with wonder as she took in the breathtaking sights around her. She had begged her father, Dr. James Harper, a renowned wildlife biologist, to take her along on this expedition deep into the Amazon rainforest. Reluctantly, he had agreed, convinced that as long as she stayed close to him and followed every precaution, she would be safe. But as curious children often do, Sophie had her own sense of adventure, one that didn't always align with the cautious approach of the adults. The team had set up camp near a small river the previous night, and now, as they prepared for another day of fieldwork, Sophie wandered a little farther than she should have. Her fascination with the jungle's vibrant beauty drew her toward a patch of bright red flowers, their petals shimmering in the sunlight. She crouched down, her fingers brushing the velvety surface of the blossoms, completely unaware of the silent predator coiled just a few feet away, hidden within the tangled roots of a towering tree. A giant reticulated python, nearly 20 feet long, lay motionless, its scales blending perfectly with the forest floor. Its beady black eyes, unblinking, tracked Sophie's every movement. Pythons, unlike other predators, rely on patience. They do not chase their prey. They wait. And now, with the small girl stepping dangerously close, the massive snake slowly adjusted its coils, readying itself for a strike. Sophie, oblivious to the impending danger, picked a small flower and tucked it behind her ear. She smiled, turning back toward the camp when, without warning, the python struck. In a flash, the serpent lunged forward, its powerful body coiling tightly around Sophie's tiny frame before she could scream. The sudden attack left her breathless, her lungs straining under the immense pressure. The python's muscular body constricted around her chest, its scales rough against her skin as it tightened its grip with each of her panicked movements. Terror filled Sophie's mind as she realized what was happening. She gasped, her small hands desperately clawing at the snake's thick coils, but she was powerless against its strength. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Only a faint whimper escaped her lips as she felt the crushing force around her ribs. Back at camp, Dr. Harper and the other researchers were engaged in documenting their findings when a sudden, piercing cry echoed through the jungle. Sophie. Dr. Harper's heart stopped. He knew that sound. It was his daughter, and it was a scream of pure terror. His instincts kicked in instantly. Grabbing a machete from his belt, he sprinted toward the direction of the scream, the other team members following close behind. The jungle blurred past him as he ran, his pulse pounding in his ears. Every second felt like an eternity. Sophie's tiny body was limp in the python's crushing embrace. Her face was pale, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the snake's constriction grew tighter. Dark spots danced before her eyes, and she felt an overwhelming wave of dizziness. Just as she thought she was about to pass out, she heard her father's frantic voice. Sophie, hold on. Dr. Harper burst through the thick foliage, his eyes instantly locking onto his daughter's small form trapped within the massive coils of the python. His breath caught in his throat. The snake had almost completely enveloped her, its powerful muscles squeezing the life out of her fragile body. No, let her go. Dr. Harper roared, his hands tightening around the machete as he lunged forward. The researchers quickly surrounded the scene, their eyes wide with horror. They had seen pythons constrict their prey before, but never had they witnessed such a terrifying sight involving a human child. The lead guide, Manuel, a seasoned jungle expert, shouted urgently, "We need to act fast. It's trying to crush her bones before swallowing her whole." Dr. Harper didn't hesitate. With all the strength he could muster, he swung the machete, the sharp steel slicing into the thick body of the snake. The python jerked violently, its coils loosening just slightly from the sudden pain. But it did not release Sophie. Instead, it tightened its grip, its instinct telling it to finish the kill. Sophie let out a strangled cry, her vision going blurry. "No, we're losing her," Manuel shouted. Dr. Harper's desperation fueled his next strike. He raised the machete high above his head and brought it down with everything he had, the blade cutting deeper into the snake's flesh. The python hissed in agony, its coils spasming. Blood oozed from the wounds, staining Sophie's torn shirt. Then, with a final furious swing, Dr. Harper severed part of the snake's body, and suddenly, the coils loosened just enough for Manuel and another team member to pull Sophie free. The little girl collapsed into her father's arms, her chest rising and falling in desperate, shallow breaths. Sophie, Sophie, talk to me. Dr. Harper's voice cracked as he gently cradled her. She gasped, her eyelids fluttering. Daddy. Tears streamed down Dr. Harper's face as he clutched her to his chest. I've got you, sweetheart. You're safe now. The python, now mortally wounded, thrashed weakly before slithering away into the jungle, its massive body leaving behind a bloody trail. Sophie trembled in her father's arms, her tiny fingers clutching onto his shirt as if she would never let go. Let's get her back to camp, Manuel urged, helping Dr. Harper lift her up. The team rushed back, their hearts still pounding from the terrifying encounter. Back at the camp, the team worked frantically to stabilize Sophie. Dr. Harper laid her down gently on a thick blanket, his hands shaking as he checked her pulse. Her breaths were uneven, her small chest rising and falling with effort. The bruises forming around her ribs were deep and dark, evidence of how dangerously close she had come to being completely crushed. Somebody get me water, Dr. Harper called out. One of the researchers, Emily, rushed over with a canteen. She knelt beside Sophie, unscrewing the cap quickly and helping her drink. Sophie coughed, the cool liquid spilling slightly from her lips as she tried to swallow. You're okay, sweetheart, Dr. Harper whispered, stroking her hair. Daddy's right here. Sophie blinked up at him, her brown eyes still filled with the remnants of terror. The snake, she croaked. Dr. Harper swallowed hard. It's gone. You're safe now. Manuel and the other guides hovered nearby, their faces grim. She needs a doctor, Manuel said urgently. We need to get her back to civilization. The bruising means internal pressure. We don't know if any ribs are broken. Dr. Harper nodded, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. We still have the satellite phone, right? Emily grabbed it from a nearby supply crate and quickly dialed for help. The jungle was too remote for a direct road evacuation, but an emergency chopper could be dispatched to a clearing about 3 miles away. They're sending a helicopter, Emily announced. They said we need to reach the clearing in 45 minutes. Dr. Harper looked down at his daughter. She was still too weak to walk. Time was against them. We'll carry her, Manuel said firmly. We need to move. No. The group wasted no time. Manuel and another guide fashioned a makeshift stretcher out of thick canvas and bamboo poles, tying it securely with rope. Dr. Harper lifted Sophie into his arms, careful not to hurt her further, and gently placed her onto the stretcher. Hang in there, sweetheart, he murmured. Sophie nodded weakly, closing her eyes as exhaustion began to take over. With the stretcher secured between two of the strongest team members, they set off into the jungle, moving as quickly as they could without jostling Sophie too much. The dense rainforest loomed around them, the sounds of insects and distant howls making their trek even more intense. The group was on edge. Though the python was gone, other predators lurked in the shadows. They moved through thick vines, stepping over fallen logs and wading through a shallow creek as sweat poured down their faces. Dr. Harper kept looking down at Sophie, his fatherly instinct screaming at him to do more, even though he knew he had done all he could. After what felt like an eternity, they finally broke through the trees into a small clearing. The whir of helicopter blades echoed through the air, signaling their lifeline out of the jungle. A team of paramedics rushed toward them, carrying a proper stretcher. She was crushed by a python, Dr. Harper explained quickly. She has severe bruising and trouble breathing. We don't know if there are internal injuries. The medics nodded, swiftly transferring Sophie onto the helicopter stretcher. One of them placed an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth, securing it in place as they prepared to lift off. Dr. Harper climbed in beside her, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't going to leave her side. As the chopper ascended, the jungle disappeared beneath them, but the terror of what had just happened still gripped his soul. His daughter had survived a python attack, but would she recover fully? The whirl of helicopter blades filled the air as the chopper lifted higher, carrying Sophie away from the jungle that had almost claimed her life. Dr. Harper sat beside her, gripping her small hand tightly as the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her. The oxygen mask covering her nose and mouth hissed with each breath, her tiny chest rising and falling at a slightly steadier pace than before. Her vitals are still weak, one of the medics said, glancing at the monitor attached to her finger. But her oxygen levels are improving. Dr. Harper nodded, his fingers trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "You're doing great, sweetheart," he whispered. "Just a little longer." Sophie blinked up at him, exhaustion dulling her usual bright eyes. Will the snake come back?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. Tears stung Dr. Harper's eyes. He swallowed the lump in his throat and shook his head firmly. "No, baby. You're safe now. I promise." The flight to the nearest hospital felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. By the time they landed on the hospital's rooftop helipad, the trauma team was already waiting. The moment the helicopter's doors slid open, the medics rushed Sophie onto a gurney and wheeled her inside. Dr. Harper hurried alongside them, trying to keep up as they sped through bright hospital hallways, the sterile scent of disinfectant filling his nostrils. Nurses and doctors surrounded Sophie, shouting orders, checking vitals, prepping her for emergency scans. A nurse gently stopped Dr. Harper at the ICU doors. "Sir, you need to wait here. We need to run some tests to assess internal damage." "But I know it's hard," the nurse said, her voice sympathetic yet firm. "But let us do our job. We'll update you as soon as we can." Dr. Harper exhaled shakily, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to push through those doors, to stay beside Sophie, to make sure she was okay. But he had no choice. He sank onto one of the stiff waiting room chairs, dropping his head into his hands. His entire body felt like it had been drained of all energy, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. Emily arrived a few minutes later, followed by Manuel. Both looked exhausted but relieved to have made it to the hospital safely. "How is she?" Emily asked, sitting beside him. "They're checking for internal injuries," Dr. Harper murmured, his voice hoarse. "I don't know anything yet." Manuel placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She's a fighter, my friend. She made it out of that jungle alive. She will get through this." Dr. Harper nodded, but his mind was filled with every terrifying possibility. He had seen too many cases in his career where people seemed fine after a trauma, only for internal bleeding or other complications to take a turn for the worse. A doctor finally emerged from the ICU, holding a clipboard. Dr. Harper shot to his feet. "How is she?" he demanded. The doctor gave a reassuring nod. "She's stable. No internal bleeding, but she has severe bruising on her ribs and lungs, which is why she was struggling to breathe. There are no broken bones, which is a miracle given the pressure she was under." Relief crashed over him like a tidal wave. His knees almost buckled, but he steadied himself. "Can I see her?" "Yes. She's been asking for you." Dr. Harper didn't wait another second. The moment he stepped into the ICU, his heart clenched. Sophie lay on a hospital bed, hooked up to N4, her small form swallowed by the crisp white sheets. But her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Daddy," she whispered. He rushed to her side, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." She curled her fingers around his, holding on as if she was afraid he'd disappear. "I was so scared." "I know, baby, but you're safe now." Sophie looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "Daddy, do you think the snake was trying to hurt me?" Dr. Harper hesitated. He had spent years studying wildlife, and he knew pythons didn't attack humans out of malice. They were predators, instinct-driven. But this was his little girl, and he knew she needed reassurance. "I think it didn't understand you weren't food," he said softly. "It made a mistake, but we made sure it let you go." Sophie was quiet for a moment, as if processing his words. Then she whispered, "I don't want to be afraid of snakes forever." Dr. Harper's heart ached with pride. Even after everything, his little girl still had the same curiosity and kindness that had always made her so special. "You don't have to be," he said gently. "We'll take it one step at a time." Sophie nodded, squeezing his hand. "Promise. Promise." Dr. Harper knew that day would haunt his dreams for years to come, but as he held his daughter's hand, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, he knew they had won the battle. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. The days following Sophie's terrifying encounter in the jungle were filled with recovery, both physical and emotional. Though her injuries were healing well, the emotional scars were harder to gauge. She would wake up some nights gasping for breath, clutching her chest as if the snake were still squeezing her, trapped in the memory of its crushing coils. Dr. Harper, now ever watchful over his daughter, would rush to her side every time she whimpered in her sleep. Emily, too, stayed close, gently soothing Sophie with soft lullabies and whispered reassurances. "I don't want to be afraid," Sophie admitted one evening as she sat in her hospital bed, staring out the window. The jungle was nowhere in sight, but she swore she could still hear the distant calls of unseen creatures, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Her father pulled a chair up beside her. "Fear is normal, sweetheart. But fear can't control you. We'll work through this together." She gave a small nod, her fingers twisting in the blanket. "I just keep thinking about its eyes," she whispered. "They weren't mean, just big, watching me." Dr. Harper hesitated before replying, choosing his words carefully. "Animals don't think the way we do, sophomore. They act on instinct, and sometimes they don't know when they're causing harm." Sophie thought about that for a long moment before looking up at him. "Do you think it let me go on purpose?" Dr. Harper opened his mouth to answer, but he stopped himself. The python had been a force of nature, a powerful predator. But had there been hesitation before it released her? Had it realized she wasn't prey and decided to let her go? He would never know for sure. "I think," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "that you're stronger than you know, and that's why you're here now." She didn't look entirely convinced, but she didn't argue either. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it tightly. A week later, Sophie was discharged from the hospital. The jungle still called to her, despite everything that had happened. She told her father as much as they walked through the hospital's garden, her four finally gone, her small steps more confident than they had been days ago. "I want to see it again," she admitted, staring at the patches of greenery that surrounded them. Dr. Harper's heart skipped a beat. "You want to go back?" "Not near the snake," she clarified quickly. "But I don't want to leave afraid." Emily, who had been trailing slightly behind, exchanged a look with Dr. Harper. "That's incredibly brave, Sophie," she said gently. Sophie squared her small shoulders. "I just don't want to feel like it won." Dr. Harper knelt in front of her, holding her hands. "The jungle isn't the enemy, sweetheart. It's just wild. Sometimes it teaches us lessons in the hardest way." She nodded, but the fire in her eyes remained. "Then I want to go back and listen to what it's trying to teach me." 2 days later, they returned to the jungle. The research camp hadn't changed, though the people there looked at Sophie with a mix of awe and concern. Her survival had quickly turned into legend among the researchers, and the story of the little girl who faced a python and lived spread faster than anyone could have expected. Sophie, however, paid no attention to the whispers. She walked through the trails, breathing in the thick jungle air, her small hand gripping her father's as they moved carefully along the edge of the forest. "Nothing feels scary in the daylight," she mused aloud, glancing at the towering trees above them. "It's just big, loud, full of life." Dr. Harper smiled. "That's exactly what it is." They didn't go near the place where Sophie had been attacked, but they listened to the sounds of the jungle, observing the creatures that scurried between the trees, the birds that called to one another from the canopy above. Then, almost too perfectly timed, a rustling came from the underbrush. Dr. Harper's entire body went rigid, his instinct screaming to pull Sophie back, but before he could, she whispered, "Wait." He forced himself to stay still. Slowly, from beneath the thick ferns and vines, a snake emerged. Not the python that had nearly taken her life, but a much smaller one, its patterned scales shimmering in the dappled sunlight. Sophie's fingers tightened around her father's, but she didn't move. She simply watched as the snake flicked its tongue, tasting the air, before slithering past them without even glancing their way. Dr. Harper let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie turned to him, her eyes wide but not fearful. "It's not chasing me," she said softly. "No," Dr. Harper agreed. "It's just living, like everything else here." She watched the snake disappear into the undergrowth, her breathing steady, her hands no longer shaking. And then, for the first time since the incident, she smiled. "I think I understand now," she whispered. Dr. Harper pulled her into a hug, holding her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. And in that moment, he knew she had one. She had faced her fear, and she had conquered it. Sophie's journey through the jungle had not only been a test of survival, but also of self-discovery. Though she had faced one of the most terrifying experiences of her life, something deep within her had changed. The fear that once gripped her chest like the coils of that python was slowly being replaced by understanding, curiosity, and resilience. As they made their way back to the research station after encountering the smaller snake, Dr. Harper kept a close eye on his daughter. He could see her mind working, processing everything she had been through. "You okay, Soph?" he asked softly, brushing a hand over her shoulder. She looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with something deeper than just relief. There was peace. "Yeah," she said with a small nod. "I think I needed to see that." Emily walked beside them, keeping her distance but listening closely. "See what?" she asked. Sophie kicked at a stray leaf in her path before replying. "That not all snakes are bad, and that they don't think like we do. I guess. I don't want to be afraid forever." Her words hit Dr. Harper harder than he expected. He had been prepared to comfort her, to protect her, to keep her far away from anything remotely dangerous. But here she was, standing in the middle of the jungle, choosing to understand rather than fear. Emily smiled at Sophie's words, admiration in her expression. "That's a really strong way to think," she said. Sophie looked down at her feet, suddenly shy, but her lips curved up slightly. Dr. Harper exhaled a breath he didn't know he had been holding. "I'm proud of you," he said, squeezing her hand. Sophie squeezed back. That night, Sophie had a dream. She was back in the jungle, but this time she wasn't running. She wasn't trapped. She stood still in the clearing, feeling the warm earth beneath her bare feet, listening to the heartbeat of the forest. The wind rustled through the leaves, and the distant cries of howler monkeys echoed above. Then, the ferns in front of her shifted. The python emerged. Its massive body coiled and uncoiled as it moved toward her, its golden eyes fixed on hers. But instead of terror gripping her, Sophie found herself rooted to the spot, watching, waiting. The snake slithered closer, its forked tongue flickering in and out, tasting the air. Sophie didn't move. The python stopped just a foot away from her, tilting its head as if studying her just as much as she was studying it. Then, in an almost surreal moment, it began to retreat. Not lunging, not coiling, not attacking, just disappearing back into the jungle. Sophie didn't wake up in a panic this time. Instead, she sat up in bed, breathing deeply, her heart steady. The fear was beginning to fade. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Dr. Harper had barely finished making breakfast when one of the local researchers, Carlos, came running into the station with an urgent expression. "You need to see this," he panted, motioning for them to follow. Dr. Harper exchanged a glance with Emily, who immediately took Sophie's hand as they hurried after Carlos into the jungle. They trekked for nearly 20 minutes, weaving through dense foliage and ducking under low-hanging branches. Then, just ahead of them, several researchers stood gathered in a small clearing, murmuring amongst themselves. And in the center of that clearing was something Sophie never expected to see again. The python. It was there, curled partially around a large fallen tree. Its long body stretched out across the damp forest floor. But something was different. The python wasn't moving. Sophie took a step forward before her father quickly pulled her back. "Sophie, wait. It's hurt," she whispered, her heart suddenly pounding. Dr. Harper narrowed his eyes and looked closer. She was right. The massive snake had a deep wound along its side, likely from a territorial dispute with another predator or a poacher's trap. The once powerful creature, the same one that had almost taken Sophie's life, now lay helpless. A part of Dr. Harper wanted to turn around and walk away, to let nature take its course. But when he looked at Sophie, he saw something else in her eyes. Not fear, not revenge, compassion. "Dad," she said, gripping his hand. "We have to help it." He hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the undeniable truth staring him in the face. Sophie had every reason to hate this creature, but instead, she wanted to save it. Emily spoke up, stepping beside Sophie. "If it was any other animal, we wouldn't think twice," she said gently. "We help when we can." Dr. Harper exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, with a reluctant nod, he turned to Carlos. "Get the medical kit." Sophie lit up. The research team carefully approached the python, keeping their movements slow and steady. Though the massive snake was injured and sluggish, its golden eyes still flickered with wariness as they worked. As Carlos and Emily cleaned the wound, Sophie watched closely, fascinated rather than afraid. The python didn't lash out. It didn't struggle. It simply watched them with the same quiet intensity that Sophie had felt that night in the jungle. And then something incredible happened. As Emily finished bandaging the wound, Sophie took an unsteady step forward. Her father tensed, ready to pull her back. But the python didn't react. Sophie knelt beside it, her small hand trembling slightly as she reached out and pressed it gently against its scales. The jungle was silent. Even the birds seemed to pause, watching this impossible moment unfold. Sophie held her breath, her palm resting against the creature that had once nearly taken everything from her. And for the first time since the attack, she wasn't afraid. She had faced her fear, and in an extraordinary twist of fate, she had saved the very thing that had once threatened her life. Her father swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie." She turned to look at him, her eyes bright and full of something indescribable. "It's okay," she whispered back. "I understand now." And for the first time in weeks, Dr. Harper realized. She really did. She wasn't just a survivor. She was something far greater. She was fearless. The days following the rescue of the python were transformative for Sophie. Something had shifted inside her. The fear that once clouded her thoughts, the nightmares that stole her sleep, they had begun to fade. Her father saw it too. Dr. Harper had always been a firm believer in nature's way. He had spent years studying, understanding, and protecting wildlife. But witnessing his daughter's growth, her courage to face the very creature that had once threatened her life, made him realize something even more profound. Fear was not meant to rule us. It was meant to teach us. Sophie's experience had become a lesson in empathy, survival, and respect for nature. And now she wanted to learn more. 1 week later, Sophie made a decision. Sitting across from her father at the research station, she cleared her throat and spoke with newfound determination. "Dad," she began, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, "I want to understand them more." Dr. Harper set his notebook aside, eyebrows raised. "Them. The snakes," she clarified. "I don't want to just be afraid of them. I want to learn about them. The way you do." Emily, who had been jotting down notes from the last field survey, looked up with interest. "That's a bold decision, Sophie." Sophie nodded, fully aware of what she was saying. She had spent the past few days watching how her father and the team interacted with the wildlife. She had listened as they spoke about conservation, about the delicate balance of life in the jungle. And now she wanted to be a part of it. Dr. Harper studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "All right," he said, closing his notebook. "Let's start today." Their first lesson was observation. Dr. Harper led Sophie and Emily to a designated study area where non-venomous snakes were often seen basking in the sun. They sat quietly, watching from a safe distance as a slender green snake slithered through the underbrush. Sophie felt the familiar rush of nervousness in her chest, but instead of letting it overwhelm her, she focused on what her father had taught her. "See how it moves?" Dr. Harper whispered. "It's slow, deliberate. It's not hunting, it's searching for warmth." Sophie nodded, fascinated. She watched how the snake flicked its tongue, sensing the world around it. Emily handed her a small notebook. "Take notes," she suggested. "Write what you see, what you feel. It'll help you process your emotions." Sophie took the notebook and jotted down what she observed. "Not scary, just curious." She underlined the words twice. She was starting to understand. The next lesson was handling. A few days later, Dr. Harper introduced Sophie to a small, harmless python that the research team had been monitoring. "Remember," he said, holding the snake gently in his hands, "they don't want to hurt us. They just want to be left alone." Sophie swallowed hard but nodded. Slowly, carefully, her father extended the snake toward her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to breathe, stay calm. She reached out, and the moment her fingers touched the python's smooth, cool scales, something clicked. It wasn't scary. It was beautiful. The python didn't lash out, didn't strike. It simply rested in her hands, unbothered, unafraid, just like her. Sophie looked up at her father, her eyes shining. "It's amazing." Dr. Harper smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You're amazing, Sophie." Then came the final test. One afternoon, Emily burst into the research station, breathless. "Dr. Harper, we've got something unusual," she said. "A python, a big one, trapped near the riverbank." Dr. Harper's expression turned serious. "Trapped?" Emily nodded. "Some local fishermen saw it get caught in a discarded net. It's still alive, but it won't last much longer if we don't act fast." Sophie felt her heart race. Python. Trapped. Helpless. She had seen a python in trouble once before, and she had chosen to help. Without hesitation, she stood. "I want to come with you." Her father hesitated. "Sophie, I need to do this, Dad." Dr. Harper searched her eyes and saw no fear, only determination. With a nod, he grabbed the medical kit. "Let's go." The rescue mission was tense. When they arrived at the riverbank, the python was in bad shape. Its massive body was twisted, tangled in the thick netting. Every time it tried to move, the fibers cut deeper into its scales. Sophie felt a pang of sympathy. "This is going to be tricky," Dr. Harper muttered, assessing the situation. "We need to cut it loose without stressing it out too much." Carlos handed him a pair of thick gloves. "I can hold its head while you work on the net." Dr. Harper nodded, then turned to Sophie. "Stay back, okay?" Sophie didn't move. "I can help," she said. Dr. Harper hesitated. "Sophie, this is different." She met his gaze. "So am I." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a small nod, he handed her a pair of gloves. "Stay by my side." Carefully, they began the delicate process of freeing the python. Dr. Harper worked quickly, cutting away the net while Carlos held the snake's head steady. Sophie helped pull away the loosened pieces, her hands steady, her mind focused. The python remained still, its golden eyes watching her. Then, finally, it was free. Carlos slowly released its head, stepping back as the massive snake uncoiled. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then, in an act that stunned everyone, the python turned its head towards Sophie. Their eyes met. It was the same quiet understanding from before. And then, without a sound, the snake slithered into the underbrush, disappearing into the jungle. Sophie exhaled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had done it. She had faced her fear and emerged stronger. Her father pulled her into a hug, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Sophie." Emily grinned. "Looks like we have a new herpetologist in the making." Sophie laughed, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. Maybe she wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe she was becoming something more. Part of the jungle. Part of something bigger. And this time, she wasn't afraid. A new chapter in the jungle. The sun began to set over the jungle, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, mingling with the distant calls of howler monkeys and the rustling of unseen creatures. Sophie sat on a log near the research station, watching as the fireflies blinked to life around her. Since the rescue, things had changed. She had changed. Dr. Harper noticed it first, the way Sophie carried herself, the way she spoke about the jungle. There was no longer a nervous edge to her words, no hesitance when she stepped through the thick foliage. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now replaced by understanding. Sophie had not only survived her terrifying encounter with the python, but she had also turned it into something powerful, a lesson in respect and resilience. And now she had a new mission: to protect what she had once feared. The conservation project begins. One evening, as Sophie helped Emily organize field notes, she overheard her father discussing an issue with Carlos and another researcher, Dr. Patel. "The local community is still wary of the snakes," Dr. Patel said, flipping through her notes. "Many of them see pythons as dangerous and unpredictable. And after what happened to Sophie, well, some are calling for them to be removed entirely." Sophie's heart sank. "They want to get rid of them?" she asked, unable to hide the concern in her voice. Dr. Harper glanced at her before nodding. "Some believe it's the only way to ensure safety." Sophie shook her head. "That's not fair. The python that grabbed me wasn't attacking. It was scared. It didn't know any better. Carlos sighed. Not everyone sees it that way, kiddo. But that's why we have to show them, Sophie insisted. We have to teach them that snakes aren't the enemy. Dr. Patel raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose we do that? Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. Then an idea struck. We could start a program, like an education project. We can show the locals how important snakes are to the jungle, how they keep the ecosystem balanced. Dr. Harper smiled, his eyes gleaming with pride. That's a bold idea, Sophie. But it could work, Emily added. If we can change the way people think about these animals, we might be able to prevent unnecessary killings. Dr. Patel considered this. It's worth a shot. Carlos chuckled, nudging Sophie playfully. Looks like you're becoming a real conservationist. Sophie grinned. Maybe she was. A meeting with the villagers. The next day, the research team arranged a meeting with the nearby village elders. The goal was simple: convince them that pythons were not a threat, but an essential part of the jungle's ecosystem. Sophie sat next to her father as the discussion began. We understand your fears, Dr. Harper started. No one wants to see another child in danger. But removing pythons from the area could cause bigger problems than you think. One of the elders, a man named Raoul, frowned. How can we trust these creatures when one nearly took your own daughter? Sophie took a deep breath. Because I've seen them differently now, she said, meeting the elder's gaze. I was terrified before, but then I learned. Snakes don't hunt people. They hunt rodents, pests that can destroy crops. Without them, the jungle changes. Dr. Patel nodded. That's true. Removing predators disrupts the balance. If we take away the pythons, we'll see a surge in small mammals, more diseases, more destruction of food sources. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Raoul's wife, an elderly woman with wise eyes, spoke next. Then what do you suggest we do? Sophie stood, hands clenched with determination. Let me show you, she said. Demonstration day. A week later, Sophie and the research team set up an interactive exhibit in the village. They brought along a few non-venomous snakes, posters with diagrams of the jungle food chain, and a slideshow explaining the importance of pythons in the ecosystem. At first, many villagers kept their distance, eyeing the snakes with suspicion. But Sophie didn't give up. One by one, she invited the children to come closer, explaining how snakes use their tongues to taste the air, how they weren't slimy but smooth and dry, and how they played a crucial role in keeping the jungle healthy. A little girl named Maya was the first to step forward. She hesitated but then reached out to touch a small python Sophie was holding. It's soft, Maya whispered in awe. Her bravery sparked curiosity in others. Soon more children, and even some adults, gathered around asking questions, learning, understanding. Raoul watched the scene unfold, arms crossed. But then Sophie did something bold. She handed the snake to him. The elder stiffened. I don't think. You don't have to hold it, Sophie said gently. Just touch it. Give it a chance. Raoul hesitated, then slowly reached out, his fingers brushing over the python's smooth scales. To everyone's surprise, he smiled. It's not what I expected, he admitted. Sophie grinned. That's what I learned, too. A changed perspective. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the village had shifted. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by curiosity, respect, and understanding. As the villagers packed up, Raoul approached Sophie and Dr. Harper. You were right, he said. Fear makes us do things we don't always think through. Maybe instead of fearing these creatures, we should learn to live alongside them. Dr. Harper extended a hand. That's all we asked. Sophie beamed. They had done it. The jungle wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be protected, cherished. And now, thanks to Sophie, another step had been taken toward harmony between people and nature. A future in the wild. Later that night, as Sophie lay in her hammock, she thought about how far she had come. A few months ago, she had been a girl who feared the jungle. Now, she was a girl who understood it. Dr. Harper sat beside her, a warm smile on his face. You know, he mused, if you keep this up, you might just grow up to be a biologist. Sophie chuckled. Maybe. Emily poked her head into the tent. Or a snake expert. Carlos grinned from the other side. Or to the next Jane Goodall of reptiles. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She belonged here, in the wild, and she was never going to be afraid again.